In October of 1692, a dog walked down a dirt road in Andover, Massachusetts, and by the end of that week, it was dead, shot by men who believed with total sincerity that they were killing a servant of Satan. Not a metaphor, not a folk tale softened by centuries of retelling. A real animal with a real heartbeat was hunted down by its own neighbors because a teenage girl pointed a finger and said the word witch. To understand how a village reaches the point where it executes a dog, you have to understand something uncomfortable about human beings. Terror doesn't need evidence. It only needs a shape to attach itself to. And in the autumn of 1692, in a cluster of Puritan settlements in New England, terror had already devoured 19 men and women on the gallows, crushed one more beneath a slowly stacking pile of stones, and left over 150 people rotting in jail cells on the accusation of invisible crimes. The dog was not the beginning of that horror. The dog was what happens after a society has already convinced itself that the devil is real, that he is close, and that he is patient enough to wear any face he chooses, including the face of the family dog sleeping by your hearth. This is the story of that killing, but it's also the story of something worse hiding underneath it. Because when you pull back the curtain on why a Puritan village decided an animal could be a witch, you find a belief system so specific, so elaborate, and so deeply rehearsed that the dog never stood a chance the moment the accusation left that girl's mouth. To the English colonists who settled Massachusetts Bay, witchcraft wasn't a fairy tale. It was theology. It was law. The Bible itself, in the book of Exodus, commanded, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." Massachusetts had turned that verse into statute. If a person was found to have or consult with a familiar spirit, the punishment was death. And a familiar spirit, in the minds of 17th century New Englanders, was not some vague ghost. It was a demon given flesh, an animal body that a witch fed, nursed, and commanded to do harm on her behalf. The idea had crossed the Atlantic from England, where witch hunters like Matthew Hopkins had spent the 1640s dragging alleged witches before magistrates and demanding they name their familiars. Cats were common, so were toads, so were rats that supposedly suckled blood from a hidden witch's teat on the accused's body. But dogs held a special, more sinister place in this cosmology, because dogs were already everywhere. They guarded homes, they herded livestock, they slept at the feet of children. A cat crossing your path at midnight was strange. A dog looking at you was Tuesday. That familiarity is exactly what made the fear so effective. The devil, according to the sermons these villagers heard every single Sunday, did not need to invent a monster. He only needed to borrow something you already trusted. But sermons alone did not seal the fate of these animals. To understand how dogs went from household pets to targets of a violent mob, we have to look at a grotesque ritual that took place months earlier, at the very beginning of the hysteria. In late February, before the mass arrests began, 2 young girls in the household of Reverend Samuel Parris began having violent, unexplainable fits. Desperate to uncover the invisible witch tormenting them, a neighbor named Mary Sibley approached Tituba, the enslaved woman of the Parris household, with a sinister proposition. Tituba was instructed to gather the ingredients for what was known as a witch cake. The recipe was a grotesque perversion of domestic life. She took coarse rye meal, sweeping the dust and chaff of the harvest into a bowl. But the binding agent was not water or milk. Tituba was instructed to collect the urine of the afflicted, convulsing children. The belief was rooted in sympathetic magic. By baking the urine, they were baking the invisible venom of the witch. When the hardened, charred cake was pulled from the ashes, folklore dictated it must be fed to an animal, specifically a dog. The twisted logic of the era held that dogs were uniquely sensitive to the supernatural, and feeding the urine-soaked cake to a canine familiar would send a shockwave of agonizing pain back to the witch, forcing them to cry out and reveal themselves. An innocent household dog was whistled over, and it ate the foul, burnt cake. The spell did not cure the girls. Instead, it acted as a catalyst for utter catastrophe. It planted a dark, terrible seed in the minds of the villagers. If a dog could be used as a conduit for black magic, if it could process the invisible venom of a witch, the line between the natural and the supernatural was obliterated. The villagers began looking at the pets on their hearths not as companions, but as potential vessels of pure, unadulterated evil. By October of 1692, the hysteria in Salem and its surrounding villages had reached a fever pitch that historians still struggle to fully explain. Andover, in fact, would ultimately produce more accused witches than Salem itself, over 40 people formally charged. The town had become a pressure cooker of suspicion, where a look, a grudge, a bad harvest, or a sick child could all be reinterpreted as evidence of a neighbor's secret pact with hell. It was in this atmosphere, soaked in weeks of executions and confessions extracted under unbearable pressure, that a girl in Andover looked at a dog belonging to a neighboring family and felt herself afflicted. She said the animal had tormented her. She said it in front of others, and in a town where a wrong word could put a noose around a human neck, that accusation against an animal moved with terrifying speed. There was no elaborate trial, no magistrate weighing evidence for weeks. The villagers who heard the accusation did what people consumed by fear tend to do. They acted immediately, before the terror could spread further, before the witch's familiar could do more harm. Someone raised a musket. The dog was shot where it stood. It was a lynching of an animal carried out by ordinary people who genuinely believed they had just stopped a demon from claiming another victim. There was no lawyer to argue the dog's innocence, no one to ask the obvious, chilling question: what if it was just a dog? Here is the detail that turns this story from tragic into genuinely disturbing, because the story does not end with the gunshot. After the animal was already dead, Cotton Mather, the same minister whose sermons had helped fuel the entire witch panic, weighed in with a theological ruling. And his ruling was this: if the dog had truly been the devil in disguise, a musket ball could never have killed it. Satan, Mather reasoned, could not be destroyed by mortal weapons. Since the dog had died from the shot, that proved, after the fact, that it had not been a supernatural creature at all. It was declared innocent. Sit with that logic for a second. The verdict of innocence came only after the execution, and the execution itself was treated as the test. If the dog survives, it's a demon and must be destroyed by other means. If the dog dies, it was innocent all along, and the villagers simply killed an ordinary animal for nothing. There was no version of events in which the dog walked away alive. The trial wasn't a trial. It was theater performed after the fact to reassure a town that had just killed something helpless that they hadn't been wrong to be afraid. And it gets worse, because this wasn't the only dog. Records and long-standing local accounts describe a second dog, accused in a separate incident during the same wave of hysteria that met a similar fate. This time, historical accounts suggest Mather did not extend the same after-the-fact pardon. The second animal was not given even the hollow comfort of a posthumous verdict of innocence. It's tempting from 3 centuries away to look at this and laugh, to see it as almost absurd, a village of grown adults convinced that a family dog was secretly Satan. But that reaction misses what actually happened in Andover and Salem in 1692, and it misses why it matters now. These weren't ignorant or foolish people by the standards of their time. They were farmers, ministers, tradesmen, and mothers living through genuine compounding disasters. A brutal frontier war with indigenous nations and the French to the north that had left refugees flooding into their towns. A smallpox outbreak, political instability after the colony's charter was revoked, and a religious culture that taught in explicit and vivid detail that the devil was actively recruiting agents in their very midst. When you tell an entire community from the pulpit every single Sunday for years that Satan is real, that he is near, and that he is disguising himself among you, eventually, something in that community breaks. Eventually, a stray dog looking at the wrong person at the wrong moment becomes proof. The killing of that dog in Andover wasn't really about the dog at all. It was the visible edge of an invisible collapse. A community so saturated in fear that it had lost the ability to tell the difference between an actual threat and an animal doing what animals have always done: existing, wandering, watching. By the following year, 1693, the fever broke almost as suddenly as it had risen. Spectral evidence was banned from future trials, and the prisoners still in jail were eventually released. But no one ever apologized to the dogs. There was no confession to give, no forgiveness to ask, because in the eyes of the people who killed them, there had never been a crime committed against an animal at all. Only a demon, correctly identified, correctly destroyed. It would take Massachusetts over 300 years until 2001 to formally exonerate every person convicted in the Salem trials. The dogs were never part of that reckoning. They remain, to this day, uncounted, casualties of a panic so total that even a household pet sleeping at someone's feet the night before could wake up the next morning already condemned. And maybe that's the detail that should actually keep you up tonight. The belief system that killed those dogs didn't require them to have done anything at all. It only required someone, somewhere, afraid enough to decide that they had.